Chapter 16 of Confidence. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Judy Mason. Confidence by Henry James. Chapter 16. It was not until our hero reached Paris on his return from the distant East that the rumour I have just mentioned acquired an appreciable consistency. Here, indeed, it took the shape of authentic information. Among a number of delayed letters which had been awaiting him at his banker's, he found a communication from Gordon Wright. During the previous year or two, his correspondence with this trusted and trusting friend had not been frequent, and Bernard had received little direct news of him. 3 or 4 short letters had overtaken him in his wanderings, letters as cordial, to all appearance, if not as voluminous, as the punctual missives of an earlier time. Bernard made a point of satisfying himself that they were as cordial. He weighed them in the scales of impartial suspicion. It seemed to him, on the whole, that there was no relaxation of Gordon's epistolary tone. If he wrote less often than he used to do, that was a thing that very commonly happened as men grew older. The closest intimacies, moreover, had phases and seasons, intermissions and revivals, and even if his friend had, in fact, averted his countenance from him, this was simply the accomplishment of a periodical revolution which would bring them in due order face to face again. Bernard made a point himself of writing tolerably often, and writing always in the friendliest tone. He made it a matter of conscience. He liked to feel that he was treating Gordon generously, and not demanding an eye for an eye. The letter he found in Paris was so short that I may give it entire. My dear Bernard, it ran, I must write to you before I write to anyone else, though unfortunately you are so far away that you can't be the first to congratulate me. Try and not be the last, however. I am going to be married as soon as possible. You know the young lady, so you can appreciate the situation. Do you remember little Blanche Evers, whom we used to see 3 years ago at Baden-Baden? Of course you remember her, for I know you used often to talk with her. You will be rather surprised, perhaps, at my having selected her as the partner of a lifetime. But we manage these matters according to our lights. I am very much in love with her, and I hold that an excellent reason. I've been ready any time this year or two to fall in love with some simple, trusting, childlike nature. I find this in perfection in this charming young girl. I find her so natural and fresh. I remember telling you once that I didn't wish to be fascinated, that I wanted to estimate scientifically the woman I should marry. I have altogether got over that, and I don't know how I ever came to talk such nonsense. I'm fascinated now, and I assure you I like it. The best of it is that I find it doesn't in the least prevent my estimating Blanche. I judge her very fairly. I see just what she is. I needn't remind you of that. She was much younger then, and she has greatly developed and improved in these 2 or 3 years, but she will always be young and innocent. I don't want her to improve too much. She came back to America with her mother the winter after we met her at Baden, but I never saw her again till 3 months ago. Then I saw her with new eyes, and I wondered I could have been so blind. But I wasn't ready for her till then, and what makes me so happy now is to know that I have come to my present way of feeling by experience. That gives me confidence. You see, I am a reasoner still, but I'm under the charm for all my reason. We are to be married in a month. Try and come back for the wedding. Blanche sends you a message, which I will give you verbatim. Tell him I am not such a silly little chatterbox as I used to be at Baden. I am a great deal wiser. I am almost as clever as Angela Vivian. She has an idea you thought Miss Vivian very clever, but it is not true that she is equally so. I am very happy. Come home and see." Bernard went home, but he was not able to reach the United States in time for Gordon's wedding, which took place at midsummer. Bernard, arriving late in the autumn, found his friend a married man of some months' standing, and was able to judge, according to his invitation, whether he appeared happy. The first effect of the letter I have just quoted had been an immense surprise. The second had been a series of reflections, which were quite the negative of surprise, and these operations of Bernard's mind had finally merged themselves in a simple sentiment of jollity. He was delighted that Gordon should be married. He felt jovial about it. He was almost indifferent to the question of whom he had chosen. Certainly, at first, the choice of Blanche Evers seemed highly incongruous. It was difficult to imagine a young woman less shaped to minister to Gordon's strenuous needs than the light-hearted and empty-headed little flirt whose inconsequent prattle had remained for Bernard one of the least importunate memories of a charming time. Blanche Evers was a pretty little goose, the prettiest of little geese, perhaps, and doubtless the most amiable, but she was not a companion for a peculiarly serious man who would like his wife to share his view of human responsibilities. What a singular selection! What a queer infatuation! Bernard had no sooner committed himself to this line of criticism than he stopped short, with the sudden consciousness of error carried almost to the point of naivete. He exclaimed that Blanche Evers was exactly the sort of girl that men of Gordon Wright's stamp always ended by falling in love with, and that poor Gordon knew very much better what he was about in this case than he had done in trying to solve the deep problem of a comfortable life with Angela Vivian. This was what your strong, solid, sensible fellows always came to. They paid, in this particular, a larger tribute to pure fancy than the people who were supposedly habitually to cultivate that muse. Blanche Evers was what the French call an article of fantasy, and Gordon had taken a pleasure in finding her deliciously useless. He cultivated utility in other ways, and it pleased and flattered him to feel that he could afford, morally speaking, to have a kittenish wife. He had within himself a fund of common sense to draw upon, so that to espouse a paragon of wisdom would be but to carry water to the fountain. He could easily make up for the deficiencies of a wife who was a little silly, and if she charmed and amused him, he could treat himself to the luxury of these sensations for themselves. He was not in the least afraid of being ruined by it, and if Blanche's bird-like chatter and turns of the head had made a fool of him, he knew it perfectly well, and simply took his stand upon his rights. Every man has a right to a little flower bed, and life is not all mere kitchen gardening. Bernard rapidly extemporized this rough explanation of the surprise his friend had offered him, and he found it all sufficient for his immediate needs. He wrote Blanche a charming note, to which she replied with a great deal of spirit and grace. Her little letter was very prettily turned, and Bernard, reading it over 2 or 3 times, said to himself that, to do her justice, she might very well have polished her intellect a trifle during these 2 or 3 years. As she was older, she could hardly help being wiser. It even occurred to Bernard that she might have profited by the sort of experience that is known as the discipline of suffering. What had become of Captain Lovelock and that tender passion which was apparently none the less genuine for having been expressed in the slang of a humorous period? Had they been permanently separated by judicious guardians, and had she been obliged to obliterate his image from her lightly beating little heart? Bernard felt sure at Baden that beneath her contemptuous airs and that impertinent consciousness of the difficulties of conquest by which a pretty American girl attests her allegiance to a civilization in which young women occupy the highest place, He had felt sure that Blanche had a high appreciation of her handsome Englishman, and that if Lovelock should continue to relish her charms, he may count upon the advantages of reciprocity. But it occurred to Bernard that Captain Lovelock had perhaps been faithless, and that at least the discourtesy of chance and the inhumanity of an elder brother might have kept him an eternal prisoner at the Hotel de Holland, where, for all Bernard knew to the contrary, he had been obliged to work out his destiny in the arduous character of a polyglot waiter, so that the poor young girl, casting backward glances along the path of Mrs. Vivian's retreat, and failing to detect the onward rush of a rescuing cavalier, had perforce believed herself forsaken, and had been obliged to summon philosophy to her aid. It was very possible that her philosophic studies had taught her the art of reflection, and that, as she would have said herself, she was tremendously toned down. Once at Baden, when Gordon Wright happened to take upon himself to remark that little Miss Evers was bored by her English gallant, Bernard had ventured to observe, in petto, that Gordon knew nothing about it. But all this was of no consequence now, and Bernard steered further and further away from the liability to detect fallacies in his friend. Gordon had engaged himself to Mary, and our critical hero had not a grain of fault to find with this resolution. It was a capital thing. It was just what he wanted. It would do him a world of good. Bernard rejoiced with him sincerely, and regretted extremely that a series of solemn engagements to pay visits in England should prevent his being present at the nuptials. They were well over, as I have said, when he reached New York. The honeymoon had waned, and the business of married life had begun. Bernard, at the end, had sailed from England rather abruptly. A friend who had a remarkably good cabin on one of the steamers was obliged by a sudden detention to give it up, and on his offering it to Longueville, the latter availed himself gratefully of this opportunity of being a little less discomposed than usual by the Atlantic billows. He therefore embarked at 2 days' notice, a fortnight earlier than he had intended, and then he had written to Gordon to expect him. Gordon, of course, had written that he was to seek no hospitality but that which Blanche was now prepared, they had a charming house, so graciously to dispense. But Bernard, nevertheless, leaving the ship early in the morning, had betaken himself to an hotel. He wished not to anticipate his welcome, and he determined to report himself to Gordon first, and to come back with his luggage later in the day. After purifying himself of his sea stains, he left his hotel and walked up the Fifth Avenue with all a newly landed voyager's enjoyment of terrestrial locomotion. It was a charming autumn day. There was a golden haze in the air. He supposed it was the Indian summer. The broad sidewalk of the Fifth Avenue was scattered over with dry leaves, crimson and orange and amber. He tossed them with his stick as he passed. They rustled and murmured with the motion, and it reminded him of the way he used to kick them in front of him over these same pavements in his riotous infancy. It was a pleasure, after many wanderings, to find himself in his native land again, and Bernard Longueville, as he went, paid his compliments to his mother city. The brightness and gaiety of the place seemed a greeting to a returning sun, and he felt a throb of affection for the freshest, the youngest, the easiest, and the most good-natured of great capitals. On presenting himself at Gordon's door, Bernard was told that the master of the house was not at home. He went in, however, to see the mistress. She was in her drawing-room, alone. She had on her bonnet, as if she had been going out. She gave him a joyous, demonstrative little welcome. She was evidently very glad to see him. Bernard had thought it possible she had improved, and she was certainly prettier than ever. He instantly perceived that she was still a chatterbox. It remained to be seen whether the quality of her discourse were finer. "Well, Mr. Longueville," she exclaimed, "where in the world did you drop from? And how long did it take you to cross the Atlantic? 3 days, eh? It couldn't have taken you many more, for it was only the other day that Gordon told me you were not to sail till the 20th. You changed your mind, eh? I didn't know you ever changed your mind. Gordon never changes his. That's not a reason, eh? Because you are not a bit like Gordon. Well, I never thought you were, except that you are a man. Now, what are you laughing at? What should you like me to call you? You are a man, I suppose. You are not a god. That's what you would like me to call you, I have no doubt. I must keep that for Gordon? I shall certainly keep it a good while. I know a good deal more about gentlemen than I did when I last saw you, and I assure you I don't think they are a bit godlike. I suppose that's why you always drop down from the sky. You think it's more divine. I remember that's the way you arrived at Baden when we were there together. The first thing we knew, you were standing in the midst of us. Do you remember that evening when you presented yourself? You came up and touched Gordon on the shoulder, and he gave a little jump. He will give another little jump when he sees you today. He gives a great many little jumps. I keep him skipping about. I remember perfectly the way we were sitting that evening at Baden, and the way you looked at me when you came up. I saw you before Gordon. I see a good many things before Gordon. What did you look at me that way for? I always meant to ask you. I was dying to know. For the simplest reason in the world, said Bernard, because you were so pretty. Ah, no, it wasn't that. I know all about that look. It was something else, as if you knew something about me. I don't know what you can have known. There was very little to know about me except that I was intensely silly. Really, I was awfully silly that summer at Baden. You wouldn't believe how silly I was, but I don't see how you could have known that before you had spoken to me. It came out in my conversation. It came out awfully. My mother was a good deal disappointed in Mrs. Vivian's influence. She had expected so much from it, but it was not poor Mrs. Vivian's fault. It was someone else's. Have you ever seen the Vivians again? They're always in Europe. They've gone to live in Paris. That evening when you came up and spoke to Gordon, I never thought that 3 years afterward I should be married to him. And I don't suppose you did either. Is that what you meant by looking at me? Perhaps you can tell the future. I wish you would tell my future. Oh, I can tell that easily, said Bernard. What will happen to me? Nothing particular. It will be a little dull. The perfect happiness of a charming woman married to the best fellow in the world. Ah, what a horrid future! Cried Blanche with a petulant little cry. I want to be happy, but I certainly don't want to be dull. If you say that again, you will make me repent of having married the best fellow in the world. I mean to be happy, but I certainly shall not be dull if I can help it. I was wrong to say that, said Bernard, because, after all, my dear young lady, there must be an excitement in having so kind a husband as you have got. Gordon's devotion is quite capable of taking a new form, of inventing a new kindness every day in the year. Blanche looked at him an instant, with less than her usual consciousness of her momentary pose. My husband is very kind, she said gently. She had hardly spoken the words when Gordon came in. He stopped a moment on seeing Bernard, glanced at his wife, blushed, flushed, and with a loud, frank exclamation of pleasure grasped his friend by both hands. It was so long since he had seen Bernard that he seemed a good deal moved. He stood there smiling, clasping his hands, looking him in the eyes, unable for some moments to speak. Bernard, on his side, was greatly pleased. It was delightful to him to look into Gordon's honest face again, and to return his manly grasp. And he looked well. He looked happy. To see that was more delightful yet. During these few instants, while they exchanged a silent pledge of renewed friendship, Bernard's elastic perception embraced several things besides the consciousness of his own pleasure. He saw that Gordon looked well and happy, but that he looked older, too, and more serious, more marked by life. He looked as if something had happened to him, as in fact something had. Bernard saw a latent spark in his friend's eye that seemed to question his own for an impression of Blanche, to question it eagerly, and yet to deprecate judgment. He saw, too, with the fact made more vivid by Gordon standing there beside her in his manly sincerity and throwing it into contrast, that Blanche was the same little posturing coquette of a Blanche whom, at Baden, he would have treated it as a broad joke that Gordon Wright should dream of marrying. He saw, in a word, that it was what it had first struck him as being, an incongruous union. All this was a good deal for Bernard to see in the course of half a minute, especially through the rather opaque medium of a feeling of irreflective joy, and his impressions at this moment have a value only in so far as they were destined to be confirmed by larger opportunity. "You have come a little sooner than we expected," said Gordon, "but you are all the more welcome." "It was rather a risk," Blanche observed. "One should be notified when one wishes to make a good impression." "Ah, my dear lady," said Bernard, "you made your impression, as far as I am concerned, a long time ago, and I doubt whether it would have gained anything to-day by your having prepared an effect." They were standing before the fireplace on the great hearth rug, and Blanche, while she listened to this speech, was feeling with uplifted arm for a curl that had strayed from her chignon. "She prepares her effects very quickly," said Gordon, laughing gently. "They follow each other very fast." Blanche kept her hand behind her head, which was bent slightly forward. Her bare arm emerged from her hanging sleeve, and, with her eyes glancing upward from under her lowered brows, she smiled at her two spectators. Her husband laid his hand on Bernard's arm. "Isn't she pretty?" he cried, and he spoke with a sort of tender delight in being sure at least of this point. "Tremendously pretty," said Bernard. "I told her so half an hour before you came in." "Ah, it was time I should arrive!" Gordon exclaimed. Blanche was manifestly not in the least discomposed by this frank discussion of her charms, for the air of distinguished esteem adopted by both of her companions diminished the crudity of their remarks. But she gave a little pout of irritated modesty, it was more becoming than anything she had done yet, and declared that if they wished to talk her over they were very welcome, but she should prefer their waiting till she got out of the room. So she left them, reminding Bernard that he was to send for his luggage and remain, and promising to give immediate orders for the preparation of his apartment. Bernard opened the door for her to pass out. She gave him a charming nod as he stood there, and he turned back to Gordon with the reflection of her smile in his face. Gordon was watching him. Gordon was dying to know what he thought of her. It was a curious mania of Gordon's, this wanting to know what one thought of the women he loved. But Bernard just now felt abundantly able to humor it. He was so pleased at seeing him tightly married. "She's a delightful creature," Bernard said, with cordial vagueness, shaking hands with his friend again. Gordon glanced at him a moment, and then, coloring a little, looked straight out of the window, whereupon Bernard remembered that these were just the terms in which, at Baden, after his companion's absence, he had attempted to qualify Angela Vivian. Gordon was conscious. He was conscious of the oddity of his situation. "Of course it surprised you," he said in a moment, still looking out of the window. "What, my dear fellow?" "My marriage." "Well, you know," said Bernard, "everything surprises me. I am of a very conjectural habit of mind. All sorts of ideas come into my head, and yet when the simplest things happen I am always rather startled. I live in a reverie, and I am perpetually waked up by people doing things." Gordon transferred his eyes from the window to Bernard's face, to his whole person. "You are waked up, but you fall asleep again." "I fall asleep very easily," said Bernard. Gordon looked at him from head to foot, smiling and shaking his head. "You are not changed," he said. "You've traveled in unknown lands, you've had, I suppose, all sorts of adventures, but you are the same man I used to know." "I'm sorry for that." "You have the same way of misrepresenting yourself." "Well, if I'm not changed," said Bernard, "I can ill afford to lose so valuable an art." "Taking you all together, I'm glad you are the same," Gordon answered simply. "But you must come into my part of the house." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Confidence. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Judy Mason. Confidence by Henry James. Chapter 17. Yes, he was conscious. He was very conscious. So Bernard reflected during the 2 or 3 first days of his visit to his friend. Gordon knew it must seem strange to so irreverent a critic that a man who had once aspired to the hand of so intelligent a girl, putting other things aside, as Angela Vivian should, as the ghost in Hamlet says, have declined upon a young lady who, in force of understanding, was so very much Miss Vivian's inferior. And this knowledge kept him ill at ease, and gave him a certain pitiable awkwardness. Bernard's sense of the anomaly grew rapidly less acute. He made various observations which helped it to seem natural. Blanche was wonderfully pretty. She was very graceful, innocent, amusing. Since Gordon had determined to marry a little goose, he had chosen the animal with extreme discernment. It had quite the plumage of a swan, and it sailed along the stream of life with an extraordinary lightness of motion. He asked himself, indeed, at times, whether Blanche were really so silly as she seemed. He doubted whether any woman could be so silly as Blanche seemed. He had a suspicion at times that, for ends of her own, she was playing a part, the suspicion arising from the fact that, as usually happens in such cases, she overplayed it. Her empty chatter, her futility, her childish coquetry and frivolity, such light wares could hardly be the whole substance of any woman's being. There was something beneath them which Blanche was keeping out of sight. She had a scrap of a mind somewhere, and even a little particle of a heart. If one looked long enough, one might catch a glimpse of these possessions. But why should she keep them out of sight? And what were the ends that she proposed to serve by this uncomfortable perversity? Bernard wondered whether she were fond of her husband, and he heard it intimated by several good people in New York who had had some observation of the courtship that she had married him for his money. He was very sorry to find that this was taken for granted, and he determined, on the whole, not to believe it. He was disgusted with the idea of such a want of gratitude, for if Gordon Wright had loved Miss Evers for herself, the young lady might certainly have discovered the intrinsic value of so disinterested a suitor. Her mother had the credit of having made the match. Gordon was known to be looking for a wife. Mrs. Evers had put her little feather-head of a daughter very much forward, and Gordon was as easily captivated as a child by the sound of a rattle. Blanche had an affection for him now, however. Bernard saw no reason to doubt that, and certainly she would have been a very flimsy creature indeed if she had not been touched by his inexhaustible kindness. She had every conceivable indulgence, and if she married him for his money, at least she had got what she wanted. She led the most agreeable life conceivable, and she ought to be in high good humor. It was impossible to have a prettier house, a prettier carriage, more jewels and laces for the adornment of a plump little person. It was impossible to go to more parties, to give better dinners, to have fewer privations or annoyances. Bernard was so much struck with all this that, advancing rapidly in the intimacy of his gracious hostess, he ventured to call her attention to her blessings. She answered that she was perfectly aware of them, and there was no pretty speech she was not prepared to make about Gordon. "I know what you want to say," she went on. "You want to say that he spoils me, and I don't see why you should hesitate. You generally say everything you want, and you needn't be afraid of me. He doesn't spoil me simply because I am so bad I can't be spoiled, but that's of no consequence. I was spoiled ages ago. Everyone spoiled me, everyone except Mrs. Vivian. I was always fond of having everything I want, and I generally managed to get it. I always had lovely clothes. Mamma thought that was a kind of a duty. If it was a duty, I don't suppose it counts as a part of the spoiling. But I was very much indulged, and I know I have everything now. Gordon is a perfect husband. I believe if I were to ask him for a present of his nose, he would cut it off and give it to me. I think I will ask him for a small piece of it some day. It will rather improve him to have an inch or two less. I don't say he's handsome, but he's just as good as he can be. Some people say that if you are very fond of a person, you always think them handsome, but I don't agree with that at all. I am very fond of Gordon, and yet I am not blinded by affection as regards his personal appearance. He's too light for my taste, and too red. And because you think people handsome, it doesn't follow that you are fond of them. I used to have a friend who was awfully handsome, the handsomest man I ever saw, and I was perfectly conscious of his defects, but I'm not conscious of Gordon's, and I don't believe he has got any. He's so intensely kind, it's quite pathetic. One would think he had done me an injury in marrying me, and that he wanted to make up for it. If he has done me an injury, I haven't discovered it yet, and I don't believe I ever shall. I certainly shall not, as long as he lets me order all the clothes I want. I have ordered 5 dresses this week, and I mean to order 2 more. When I told Gordon, what do you think he did? He simply kissed me. Well, if that's not expressive, I don't know what he could have done. He kisses me about 17 times a day. I suppose it's very improper for a woman to tell anyone how often her husband kisses her, but as you happen to have seen him do it, I don't suppose you will be scandalized. I know you are not easily scandalized. I'm not afraid of you. You were scandalized at my getting so many dresses? Well, I told you I was spoiled. I freely acknowledge it. That's why I was afraid to tell Gordon, because when I was married I had such a lot of things. I was supposed to have dresses enough to last for a year, but Gordon hadn't to pay for them, so there was no harm in my letting him feel that he has a wife. If he thinks I'm extravagant, he can easily stop kissing me. You don't think it would be easy to stop? It's very well, then, for those that have never begun. Bernard had a good deal of conversation with Blanche, of which, so far as she was concerned, the foregoing remarks may serve as a specimen. Gordon was away from home during much of the day. He had a chemical laboratory in which he was greatly interested, and which he took Bernard to see. It was fitted up with the latest contrivances for the pursuit of experimental science, and was the resort of needy young students who enjoyed, at Gordon's expense, the opportunity for pushing their researches. The place did great honour to Gordon's liberality and to his ingenuity, but Blanche, who had also paid it a visit, could never speak of it without a pretty little shudder. "Nothing would induce me to go there again," she declared, "and I consider myself very fortunate to have escaped from it with my life. It's filled with all sorts of horrible things that fizzle up and go off, or that make you turn some dreadful colour if you look at them. I expect to hear a great clap some day, and half an hour afterward to see Gordon brought home in several hundred small pieces, put up in a dozen little bottles. I got a horrid little stain in the middle of my dress that one of the young men, the young savants, was so good as to drop there. Did you see the young savants who work under Gordon's orders? I thought they were too forlorn. There isn't one of them you would look at. If you can believe it, there wasn't one of them that looked at me. They took no more notice of me than if I had been the charwoman. They might have shown me some attention at least as the wife of the proprietor. What is it that Gordon's called? Isn't there some other name? If you say proprietor, it sounds as if he kept an hotel. I certainly don't want to pass for the wife of an hotel keeper. What does he call himself? He must have some name. I hate telling people he's a chemist. It sounds as if he kept a shop. That's what they call the druggists in England, and I formed the habit while I was there. It makes me feel as if he were some dreadful little man, with big green bottles in the window, and Night Bell painted outside. He doesn't call himself anything? Well, that's exactly like Gordon. I wonder he consents to have a name at all. When I was telling someone about the young men who work under his orders, the young savants, he said I must not say that. I must not speak of their working under his orders. I don't know what he would like me to say. Under his inspiration? During the hours of Gordon's absence, Bernard had frequent colloquies with his friend's wife, whose irresponsible prattle amused him, and in whom he tried to discover some faculty, some quality, which might be a positive guarantee of Gordon's future felicity. But often, of course, Gordon was an auditor as well. I say an auditor, because it seemed to Bernard that he had grown to be less of a talker than of yore. Doubtless, when a man finds himself united to a garrulous wife, he naturally learns to hold his tongue. But sometimes, at the close of one of Blanche's discursive monologues, on glancing at her husband just to see how he took it, and seeing him sit perfectly silent with a fixed, inexpressive smile, Bernard said to himself that Gordon found the lesson of listening attended with some embarrassments. Gordon, as the years went by, was growing a little inscrutable. But this, too, in certain circumstances, was a usual tendency. The operations of the mind, with deepening experience, became more complex, and people were less apt to emit immature reflections at 40 than they had been in their earlier days. Bernard felt a great kindness in these days for his old friend. He never yet had seemed to him such a good fellow, nor appealed so strongly to the benevolence of his disposition. Sometimes, of old, Gordon used to irritate him, but this danger appeared completely to have passed away. Bernard prolonged his visit. It gave him pleasure to be able to testify in this manner to his good will. Gordon was the kindest of hosts, and if in conversation, when his wife was present, he gave precedence to her superior powers, he had at other times a good deal of pleasant bachelor talk with his guest. He seemed very happy. He had plenty of occupation and plenty of practical intentions. The season went on, and Bernard enjoyed his life. He enjoyed the keen and brilliant American winter, and he found it very pleasant to be treated as a distinguished stranger in his own land, a situation to which his long and repeated absences had relegated him. The hospitality of New York was profuse, the charm of its daughters extreme, the radiance of its skies superb. Bernard was the restless and professionless mortal that we know, wandering in life from one vague experiment to another, constantly gratified and never satisfied, to whom no imperious finality had as yet presented itself. And, nevertheless, for a time he contrived to limit his horizon to the passing hour, and to make a good many hours pass in the drawing-room of a demonstrative flirt. For Mrs. Gordon was a flirt. That had become tolerably obvious. Bernard had known of old that Blanche Evers was one, and 2 or 3 months' observation of his friend's wife assured him that she did not judge a certain ethereal coquetry to be inconsistent with the conjugal character. Blanche flirted, in fact, more or less, with all men, but her opportunity for playing her harmless batteries upon Bernard were, of course, exceptionally large. The poor fellow was perpetually under fire, and it was inevitable that he should reply with some precision of aim. It seemed to him all child's play, and it is certain that when his back was turned to his pretty hostess, he never found himself thinking of her. He had not the least reason to suppose that she thought of him. Excessive concentration of mind was the last vice of which he accused her. But before the winter was over, he discovered that Mrs. Gordon Wright was being talked about, and that his own name was, as the newspapers say, mentioned in connection with that of his friend's wife. The discovery greatly disgusted him. Bernard Longueville's chronicler must do him the justice to say that it failed to yield him an even transient thrill of pleasure. He thought it very improbable that this vulgar rumour had reached Gordon's ears, but he nevertheless, very naturally, instantly made up his mind to leave the house. He lost no time in saying to Gordon that he had suddenly determined to go to California, and that he was sure he must be glad to get rid of him. Gordon expressed no surprise and no regret. He simply laid his hand on his shoulder and said, very quietly, looking at him in the eyes, "Very well. The pleasantest things must come to an end." It was not until an hour afterward that Bernard said to himself that his friend's manner of receiving the announcement of his departure had been rather odd. He had neither said a word about his staying longer, nor urged him to come back again, and there had been, it now seemed to Bernard, an audible undertone of relief in the single sentence with which he assented to his visitor's withdrawal. Could it be possible that poor Gordon was jealous of him, that he had heard this loathsome gossip, or that his own observation had given him an alarm? He had certainly never betrayed the smallest sense of injury, but it was to be remembered that even if he were uneasy, Gordon was quite capable, with his characteristic habit of weighing everything, his own honor included, in scrupulously adjusted scales, of denying himself the luxury of active suspicion. He would never have let a half suspicion make a difference in his conduct, and he would not have dissimulated. He would simply have resisted belief. His hospitality had been without a flaw, and if he had really been wishing Bernard out of his house, he had behaved with admirable self-control. Bernard, however, followed this train of thought a very short distance. It was odious to him to believe that he could have appeared to Gordon, however guiltlessly, to have invaded even in imagination the mystic line of the marital monopoly. Not to say that, moreover, if one came to that, he really cared about as much for poor little Blanche as for the weathercock on the nearest steeple. He simply hurried his preparations for departure, and he told Blanche that he should have to bid her farewell on the following day. He found her in the drawing-room, waiting for dinner. She was expecting company to dine, and Gordon had not yet come down. She was sitting in the vague glow of the firelight, in a wonderful blue dress, with two little blue feet crossed on the rug and pointed at the hearth. She received Bernard's announcement with small satisfaction, and expended a great deal of familiar ridicule on his project of a journey to California. Then, suddenly getting up and looking at him a moment, "I know why you're going," she said. "I am glad to hear my explanations have not been lost." "Your explanations are all nonsense. You're going for another reason." "Well," said Bernard, "if you insist upon it, it's because you were too sharp with me." "It's because of me. So much as that is true." Bernard wondered what she was going to say, if she were going to be silly enough to allude to the most impudent of fictions. Then, as she stood, opening and closing her blue fan, and smiling at him in the firelight, he felt that she was silly enough for anything. "It's because of all the talk. It's because of Gordon. You needn't be afraid of Gordon." "Afraid of him? I don't know what you mean," said Bernard gravely. Blanche gave a little laugh. "You have discovered that people are talking about us, about you and me. I must say I wonder you care. I don't care, and if it's because of Gordon, you might as well know that he doesn't care. If he doesn't care, I don't see why I should, and if I don't see why you should." "You pay too much attention to such insipid drivel in even mentioning it." "Well, if I have the credit of saying what I shouldn't to you or anyone else, I don't see why I shouldn't have the advantage, too. Gordon doesn't care. He doesn't care what I do or say. He doesn't care a pin for me." She spoke in her usual rattling, rambling voice, and brought out this declaration with a curious absence of resentment. "You talk about advantage," said Bernard. "I don't see what advantage it is to you to say that." "I want to. I must. I will. That's the advantage." This came out with a sudden sharpness of tone. She spoke more excitedly. "He doesn't care a button for me, and he never did. I don't know what he married me for. He cares for something else. He thinks of something else. I don't know what it is. I suppose it's chemistry." These words gave Bernard a certain shock, but he had his intelligence sufficiently in hand to contradict them with energy. "You labor under a monstrous delusion," he exclaimed. "Your husband thinks you fascinating." This epithet, pronounced with a fine distinctness, was ringing in the air when the door opened and Gordon came in. He looked for a moment from Bernard to his wife, and then, approaching the latter, he said softly, "Do you know that he leaves us tomorrow?" End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Confidence. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Judy Mason. Confidence by Henry James. Chapter 18. Bernard left then and went to California, but when he arrived there he asked himself why he had come, and was unable to mention any other reason than that he had announced it. He began to feel restless again, and to drift back to that chronic chagrin which had accompanied him through his long journey in the East. He succeeded, however, in keeping these unreasonable feelings at bay for some time, and he strove to occupy himself, to take an interest in Californian problems. Bernard, however, was neither an economist nor a cattle fancier, and he found that, as the phrase is, there was not a great deal to take hold of. He wandered about, admired the climate and the big peaches, thought a while of going to Japan, and ended by going to Mexico. In this way he passed several months, and justified, in the eyes of other people at least, his long journey across the continent. At last he made it again in the opposite sense. He went back to New York, where the summer had already begun, and here he invented a solution for the difficulty presented by life to a culpably unoccupied and ill-regulated man. The solution was not in the least original, and I am almost ashamed to mention so stale and conventional a device. Bernard simply hit upon the plan of returning to Europe. Such as it was, however, he carried it out with an audacity worthy of a better cause, and was sensibly happier since he had made up his mind to it. Gordon Wright and his wife were out of town, but Bernard went into the country as boldly as you please to inform them of his little project and take a long leave of them. He had made his arrangements to sail immediately, and as at such short notice it was impossible to find good quarters on one of the English vessels, he had engaged a berth on a French steamer, which would convey him to Havre. On going down to Gordon's house in the country, he was conscious of a good deal of eagerness to know what had become of that latent irritation of which Blanche had given him a specimen. Apparently it had quite subsided. Blanche was wreathed in smiles. She was living in a bower of roses. Bernard, indeed, had no opportunity for investigating her state of mind, for he found several people in the house, and Blanche, who had an exalted standard of the duties of a hostess, was occupied in making life agreeable to her guests, most of whom were gentlemen. She had in this way that great remedy for dissatisfaction which Bernard lacked, something interesting to do. Bernard felt a good deal of genuine sadness in taking leave of Gordon, to whom he contrived to feel even more kindly than in earlier days. He had quite forgotten that Gordon was jealous of him, which he was not, as Bernard said. Certainly Gordon showed nothing of it now, and nothing could have been more friendly than their parting. Gordon also, for a man who was never boisterous, seemed very contented. He was fond of exercising hospitality, and he confessed to Bernard that he was just now in the humour for having his house full of people. Fortune continued to gratify this generous taste, for just as Bernard was coming away another guest made his appearance. The newcomer was none other than the Honourable Augustus Lovelock, who had just arrived in New York, and who, as he added, had long desired to visit the United States. Bernard merely witnessed his arrival, and was struck with the fact that as he presented himself it seemed quite a surprise. Blanche really stopped chattering. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Confidence. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Confidence by Henry James. Chapter 19. I have called it a stale expedient on Bernard Longueville's part to go to Europe again, like the most commonplace American. And it is certain that, as our young man stood and looked out of the window of his inn at Havre an hour after his arrival at that seaport, his adventure did not strike him as having any great freshness. He had no plans nor intentions. He had not even any very definite desires. He had felt the impulse to come back to Europe, and he had obeyed it. But now that he had arrived, his impulse seemed to have little more to say to him. He perceived it indeed mentally, in the attitude of a small street boy playing upon his nose with that vulgar gesture which is supposed to represent the elation of successful fraud. There was a large blank wall before his window, painted a dirty yellow, and much discolored by the weather. A broad patch of summer sunlight rested upon it, and brought out the full vulgarity of its complexion. Bernard stared a while at this blank wall, which struck him in some degree as a symbol of his own present moral prospect. Then suddenly he turned away, with the declaration that, whatever truth there might be in symbolism, he at any rate had not come to Europe to spend the precious remnant of his youth in a malodorous Norman seaport. The weather was very hot, and neither the hotel nor the town at large appeared to form an attractive séjour for persons of an irritable nostril. To go to Paris, however, was hardly more attractive than to remain at Havre, for Bernard had a lively vision of the heated bitumen and the glaring frontages of the French capital. But if a Norman town was close and dull, the Norman country was notoriously fresh and entertaining. And the next morning Bernard got into a calèche with his luggage and bade its proprietor drive him along the coast. Once he had begun to rumble through this charming landscape, he was in much better humor with his situation. The air was freshened by a breeze from the sea. The blooming country, without walls or fences, lay open to the traveller's eye. The grain fields and copses were shimmering in the summer wind. The pink-faced cottages peeped through the ripening orchard boughs, and the gray towers of the old churches were silvered by the morning light of France. At the end of some 3 hours, Bernard arrived at a little watering place which lay close upon the shore, in the embrace of a pair of white-armed cliffs. It had a quaint and primitive aspect, and a natural picturesqueness which commended it to Bernard's taste. There was evidently a great deal of nature about it, and at this moment nature, embodied in the clear, gay sunshine, in the blue and quiet sea, in the daisied grass of the high-shouldered downs, had an air of inviting the intelligent observer to postpone his difficulties. Blanquet-les-Galets, as Bernard learned the name of this unfashionable resort to be, was 20 miles from a railway, and the place wore an expression of unaffected rusticity. Bernard stopped at an inn for his noonday breakfast, and then, with his appreciation quickened by the homely felicity of this repast, determined to go no further. He engaged a room at the inn, dismissed his vehicle, and gave himself up to the contemplation of French seaside manners. These were chiefly to be observed upon a pebbly strand which lay along the front of the village and served as the gathering point of its idler inhabitants. Bathing in the sea was the chief occupation of these good people, including, as it did, prolonged spectatorship of the process, and infinite conversation upon its mysteries. The little world of Blanquet appeared to form a large family party of highly developed amphibious habits, which sat gossiping all day upon the warm pebbles, occasionally dipping into the sea and drying itself in the sun, without any relaxation of personal intimacy. All this was very amusing to Bernard, who in the course of the day took a bath with the rest. The ocean was, after all, very large, and when one took one's plunge one seemed to have it quite to one's self. When he had dressed again, Bernard stretched himself on the beach, feeling happier than he had done in a long time, and pulled his hat over his eyes. The feeling of happiness was an odd one. It had come over him suddenly without visible cause, but such as it was, our hero made the most of it. As he lay there, it seemed to deepen. His immersion and his exercise in the salt water had given him an agreeable languor. This presently became a drowsiness which was not less agreeable, and Bernard felt himself going to sleep. There were sounds in the air above his head, sounds of the crunching and rattling of the loose, smooth stones as his neighbors moved about on them, of high-pitched French voices exchanging colloquial cries, of the plash of the bathers in the distant water, and the short, soft breaking of the waves. But these things came to his ears more vaguely and remotely, and at last they faded away. Bernard enjoyed half an hour of that light and easy slumber which is apt to overtake idle people in recumbent attitudes in the open air on August afternoons. It brought with it an exquisite sense of rest, and the rest was not spoiled by the fact that it was animated by a charming dream. Dreams are vague things, and this one had the defects of its species, but it was somehow concerned with the image of a young lady whom Bernard had formerly known, and who had beautiful eyes into which, in the dream, he found himself looking. He waked up to find himself looking into the crown of his hat, which had been resting on the bridge of his nose. He removed it, and half raised himself, resting on his elbow, and preparing to taste in another position of a little more of that exquisite rest of which mention has just been made. The world about him was still amusing and charming, the chatter of his companions losing itself in the large sea presence, the plash of the divers and swimmers, the deep blue of the ocean, and the silvery white of the cliff had that striking air of indifference to the fact that his mind had been absent from them which we are apt to find in mundane things on emerging from a nap. The same people were sitting near him on the beach, the same and yet not quite the same. He found himself noticing a person whom he had not noticed before, a young lady who was seated in a low portable chair some dozen yards off, with her eyes bent upon a book. Her head was in shade, her large parasol made indeed an awning for her whole person, which in this way, in the quiet attitude of perusal, seemed to abstract itself from the glare and murmur of the beach. The clear shadow of her umbrella, it was lined with blue, was deep upon her face, but it was not deep enough to prevent Bernard from recognizing a profile that he knew. He suddenly sat upright with an intensely quickened vision. Was he dreaming still, or had he waked? In a moment he felt that he was acutely awake. He heard her, across the interval, turn the page of her book. For an instant, as she did so, she looked with level brows at the glittering ocean, then lowering her eyes, she went on with her reading. In this barely perceptible movement he saw Angela Vivian. It was wonderful how well he remembered her. She was evidently reading very seriously. She was much interested in her book. She was alone. Bernard looked about for her mother, but Mrs. Vivian was not in sight. By this time Bernard had become aware that he was agitated. The exquisite rest of a few moments before had passed away. His agitation struck him as unreasonable. In a few minutes he made up his mind that it was absurd. He had done her an injury, yes. But as she sat there losing herself in a French novel, Bernard could see it was a French novel. He could not make out that she was the worse for it. It had not affected her appearance. Miss Vivian was still a handsome girl. Bernard hoped she would not look toward him or recognize him. He wished to look at her at his ease, to think it over, to make up his mind. The idea of meeting Angela Vivian again had often come into his thoughts. I may indeed say that it was a tolerably familiar presence there. But the fact nevertheless now presented itself with all the violence of an accident for which he was totally unprepared. He had often asked himself what he should say to her, how he should carry himself, and how he should probably find the young lady. But with whatever ingenuity he might at the moment have answered these questions, his intelligence at present felt decidedly overtaxed. She was a very pretty girl to whom he had done a wrong. This was the final attitude into which, with a good deal of preliminary shifting and wavering, she had settled in his recollection. The wrong was a right, doubtless, from certain points of view, but from the girl's own it could only seem an injury, to which its having been inflicted by a clever young man, with whom she had been on agreeable terms, necessarily added a touch of baseness. In every disadvantage that a woman suffers at the hands of a man, there is inevitably, in what concerns the man, an element of cowardice. When I say inevitably, I mean that this is what the woman sees in it. This is what Bernard believed that Angela Vivian saw in the fact that by giving his friend a bad account of her, he had prevented her making an opulent marriage. At first he had said to himself that, whether he had held his tongue or spoken, she had already lost her chance, but with time somehow this reflection had lost its weight in the scale. It conveyed little reassurance to his irritated conscience. It had become imponderable and impertinent. At the moment of which I speak, it entirely failed to present itself even for form's sake, and as he sat there looking at this superior creature, who came back to him out of an episode of his past, he thought of her simply as an unprotected woman toward whom he had been indelicate. It is not an agreeable thing for a delicate man like Bernard Longueville to have to accommodate himself to such an accident, but this is nevertheless what it seemed needful that he should do. If she bore him a grudge, he must think it natural. If she had vowed him a hatred, he must allow her the comfort of it. He had done the only thing possible, but that made it no better for her. He had wronged her. The circumstances mattered nothing, and as he could not make it up to her, the only reasonable thing was to keep out of her way. He had stepped into her path now, and the proper thing was to step out of it. If it could give her no pleasure to see him again, it could certainly do him no good to see her. He had seen her by this time pretty well, as far as mere seeing went, and as yet apparently he was none the worse for that. But his hope that he should himself escape unperceived had now become acute. It is singular that this hope should not have led him instantly to turn his back and move away, but the explanation of his imprudent delay is simply that he wished to see a little more of Miss Vivian. He was unable to bring himself to the point. Those clever things that he might have said to her quite faded away. The only good taste was to take himself off and spare her the trouble of inventing civilities that she could not feel. And yet he continued to sit there from moment to moment, arrested, detained, fascinated by the accident of her not looking round, of her having let him watch her so long. She turned another page and another, and her reading absorbed her still. He was so near her that he could have touched her dress with the point of his umbrella. At last she raised her eyes and rested them a while on the blue horizon, straight in front of her, but as yet without turning them aside. This, however, augmented the danger of her doing so, and Bernard, with a good deal of an effort, rose to his feet. The effort doubtless kept the movement from being either as light or as swift as it might have been, and it vaguely attracted his neighbor's attention. She turned her head and glanced at him, with a glance that evidently expected but to touch him and pass. It touched him, and it was on the point of passing. Then it suddenly checked itself. She had recognized him. She looked at him, straight and open-eyed, out of the shadow of her parasol, and Bernard stood there, motionless now, receiving her gaze. How long it lasted need not be narrated. It was probably a matter of a few seconds, but to Bernard it seemed a little eternity. He met her eyes, he looked straight into her face. Now that she had seen him, he could do nothing else. Bernard's little eternity, however, came to an end. Miss Vivian dropped her eyes upon her book again. She let them rest upon it only a moment, then she closed it and slowly rose from her chair, turning away from Bernard. He still stood looking at her, stupidly, foolishly, helplessly enough, as it seemed to him. No sign of recognition had been exchanged. Angela Vivian hesitated a minute. She now had her back turned to him, and he fancied her light, flexible figure was agitated by her indecision. She looked along the sunny beach, which stretched its shallow curve to where the little bay ended and the white wall of the cliffs began. She looked down toward the sea and up toward the little casino, which was perched on a low embankment communicating with the beach at 2 or 3 points by a short flight of steps. Bernard saw, or supposed he saw, that she was asking herself whither she had best turn to avoid him. He had not blushed when she looked at him. He had rather turned a little pale. But he blushed now, for it really seemed odious to have literally driven the poor girl to bay. Miss Vivian decided to take refuge in the casino, and she passed along one of the little pathways of planks that were laid here and there across the beach, and directed herself to the nearest flight of steps. Before she had gone 2 paces, a complete change came over Bernard's feeling. His only wish now was to speak to her, to explain, to tell her he would go away. There was another row of steps at a short distance behind him. He rapidly ascended them and reached the little terrace of the casino. Miss Vivian stood there. She was apparently hesitating again which way to turn. Bernard came straight up to her with a gallant smile and a greeting. The comparison is a coarse one, but he felt that he was taking the bull by the horns. Angela Vivian stood watching him arrive. "You didn't recognize me," he said, "and your not recognizing me made me hesitate." For a moment she said nothing, and then, "You are more timid than you used to be," she answered. He could hardly have said what expression he had expected to find in her face. His apprehension had perhaps not painted her obtrusively pale and haughty, aggressively cold and stern, but it had figured something different from the look he encountered. Miss Vivian was simply blushing. That was what Bernard mainly perceived. He saw that her surprise had been extreme, complete. Her blush was reassuring. It contradicted the idea of impatient resentment, and Bernard took some satisfaction in noting that it was prolonged. "Yes, I am more timid than I used to be," he said. In spite of her blush, she continued to look at him very directly, but she had always done that. She always met one's eye. And Bernard now instantly found all the beauty that he had ever found before in her pure, unevasive glance. "I don't know whether I am more brave," she said, "but I must tell the truth. I instantly recognized you." "You gave no sign." "I supposed I gave a striking one in getting up and going away." "Ah," said Bernard, "as I say, I am more timid than I was, and I didn't venture to interpret that as a sign of recognition. It was a sign of surprise." "Not of pleasure?" said Bernard. He felt this to be a venturesome, and from the point of view of taste perhaps a reprehensible remark. But he made it because he was now feeling his ground, and it seemed better to make it gravely than with assumed jocosity. "Great surprises are to me never pleasures," Angela answered. "I am not fond of shocks of any kind. The pleasure is another matter. I have not yet got over my surprise." "If I had known you were here, I would have written to you beforehand," said Bernard, laughing. Miss Vivian, beneath her expanded parasol, gave a little shrug of her shoulders. "Even that would have been a surprise. You mean a shock, eh? Did you suppose I was dead?" Now at last she lowered her eyes, and her blush slowly died away. "I knew nothing about it. Of course you couldn't know, and we are all mortal. It was natural that you shouldn't expect, simply on turning your head, to find me lying on the pebbles at Blanquet-les-Galets. You were a great surprise to me as well. But I differ from you. I like surprises." "It is rather refreshing to hear that one is a surprise," said the girl. "Especially when in that capacity one is liked," Bernard exclaimed. "I don't say that, because such sensations pass away. I am now beginning to get over mine." The light mockery of her tone struck him as the echo of an unforgotten air. He looked at her a moment, and then he said, "You are not changed. I find you quite the same." "I am sorry for that," and she turned away. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Where are you going?" She looked about her without answering, up and down the little terrace. The Casino at Blanquais was a much more modest place of reunion than the Conversation House at Baden Baden. It was a small, low structure of brightly painted wood, containing but 3 or 4 rooms, and furnished all along its front with a narrow, covered gallery, which offered a delusive shelter from the rougher moods of the fine, fresh weather. It was somewhat rude and shabby, the subscription for the season was low, but it had a simple picturesqueness. Its little terrace was a very convenient place for a stroll, and the great view of the ocean and of the marble white crags that formed the broad gateway of the shallow bay was a sufficient compensation for the absence of luxuries. There were a few people sitting in the gallery and a few others scattered upon the terrace, but the pleasure seekers of Blanquais were, for the most part, immersed in the salt water or disseminated on the grassy downs. "I am looking for my mother," said Angela Vivian. "I hope your mother is well." "Very well, thank you." "May I help you to look for her?" Bernard asked. Her eyes paused in their quest and rested a moment upon her companion. "She is not here," she said presently. "She has gone home." "What do you call home?" Bernard demanded. "The sort of place that we always call home, a bad little house that we have taken for a month." "Will you let me come and see it?" "It's nothing to see." Bernard hesitated a moment. "Is that a refusal?" "I should never think of giving it so fine a name." "There would be nothing fine in forbidding me your door. Don't think that," said Bernard, with rather a forced laugh. It was difficult to know what the girl thought, but she said in a moment, "We shall be very happy to see you. I am going home." "May I walk with you so far?" asked Bernard. "It is not far. It's only 3 minutes." And Angela moved slowly to the gate of the Casino. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Confidence. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Confidence by Henry James, Chapter 20. Bernard walked beside her, and for some moments nothing was said between them. As the silence continued, he became aware of it, and it vexed him that she should leave certain things unsaid. She had asked him no question, neither whence he had come, nor how long he would stay, nor what had happened to him since they parted. He wished to see whether this was intention or accident. He was already complaining to himself that she expressed no interest in him, and he was perfectly aware that this was a ridiculous feeling. He had come to speak to her in order to tell her that he was going away, and yet at the end of 5 minutes he had asked leave to come and see her. This sudden gyration of mind was grotesque, and Bernard knew it, but nevertheless he had an immense expectation that if he should give her time she would manifest some curiosity as to his own situation. He tried to give her time, he held his tongue, but she continued to say nothing. They passed along a sort of winding lane, where 2 or 3 fishermen's cottages, with old brown nets suspended on the walls and drying in the sun, stood open to the road, on the other side of which was a patch of salt-looking grass, browsed by a donkey that was not fastidious. "It's so long since we parted, and we have so much to say to each other," Bernard exclaimed at last, and he accompanied this declaration with a laugh much more spontaneous than the one he had given a few moments before. It might have gratified him, however, to observe that his companion appeared to see no ground for joking in the idea that they should have a good deal to say to each other. "Yes, it's a long time since we spent those pleasant weeks at Baden," she rejoined. "Have you been there again?" This was a question, and though it was a very simple one, Bernard was charmed with it. "I wouldn't go back for the world," he said. "And you?" Would I go back? Oh, yes, I thought it so agreeable. With this he was less pleased. He had expected the traces of resentment, and he was actually disappointed at not finding them. But here was the little house of which his companion had spoken, and it seemed indeed a rather bad one. That is, it was one of those diminutive structures which are known at French watering places as chalets, and with an exiguity of furniture are let for the season to families that pride themselves upon their powers of contraction. This one was a very humble specimen of its class, though it was, doubtless, a not inadequate abode for two quiet and frugal women. It had a few inches of garden, and there were flowers in pots in the open windows, where some extremely fresh white curtains were gently fluttering in the breath of the neighboring ocean. The little door stood wide open. "This is where we live," said Angela, and she stopped and laid her hand upon the little garden gate. "It's very fair," said Bernard. "I think it's better than the pastry cook's at Baden." They stood there, and she looked over the gate at the geraniums. She did not ask him to come in, but on the other hand, keeping the gate closed, she made no movement to leave him. The Casino was now quite out of sight, and the whole place was perfectly still. Suddenly turning her eyes upon Bernard with a certain strange inconsequence, "I have not seen you here before," she observed. He gave a little laugh. "I suppose it's because I only arrived this morning. I think that if I had been here you would have noticed me." "You arrived this morning?" "3 or 4 hours ago. So if the remark were not in questionable taste, I should say we had not lost time." "You may say what you please," said Angela simply. "Where did you come from?" Interrogation, now it had come, was most satisfactory, and Bernard was glad to believe that there was an element of the unexpected in his answer. "From California." "You came straight from California to this place?" "I arrived at Havre only yesterday." "And why did you come here?" "It would be graceful of me to be able to answer." "Because I knew you were here. But unfortunately I did not know it. It was a mere chance, or rather I feel like saying it was an inspiration." Angela looked at the geraniums again. "It was very singular," she said. "We might have been in so many places besides this one, and you might have come to so many places besides this one. It is all the more singular that one of the last persons I saw in America was your charming friend Blanche, who married Gordon Wright. She didn't tell me you were here." "She had no reason to know it," said the girl. "She is not my friend, as you are her husband's friend." "Ah, no, I don't suppose that. But she might have heard from you." "She doesn't hear from us. My mother used to write to her for a while after she left Europe, but she has given it up." She paused a moment, and then she added, "Blanche is too silly." Bernard noted this, wondering how it bore upon his theory of a spiteful element in his companion. Of course Blanche was silly, but equally of course this young lady's perception of it was quickened by Blanche's having married a rich man whom she herself might have married. "Gordon doesn't think so," Bernard said. Angela looked at him a moment. "I am very glad to hear it," she rejoined gently. "Yes, it is very fortunate." "Is he well?" the girl asked. "Is he happy?" "He has all the air of it." "I am very glad to hear it," she repeated, and then she moved the latch of the gate and passed in. At the same moment her mother appeared in the open doorway. Mrs. Vivian had apparently been summoned by the sound of her daughter's colloquy with an unrecognized voice, and when she saw Bernard she gave a sharp little cry of surprise. Then she stood gazing at him. Since the dispersion of the little party at Baden Baden he had not devoted much meditation to this conscientious gentlewoman who had been so tenderly anxious to establish her daughter properly in life. But there had been in his mind a tacit assumption that if Angela deemed that he had played her a trick, Mrs. Vivian's view of his conduct was not more charitable. He felt that he must have seemed to her very unkind, and that, in so far as a well-regulated conscience permitted the exercise of unpractical passions, she honored him with a superior detestation. The instant he beheld her on her threshold, this conviction rose to the surface of his consciousness and made him feel that now at least his hour had come. "It is Mr. Longueville whom we met at Baden," said Angela to her mother gravely. Mrs. Vivian began to smile and stepped down quickly toward the gate. Ah, Mr. Longueville, she murmured, it's so long, it's so pleasant, it's so strange. And suddenly she stopped, still smiling. Her smile had an odd intensity. She was trembling a little, and Bernard, who was prepared for hissing scorn, perceived with a deep and almost violent surprise a touching agitation, an eager friendliness. "Yes, it's very long," he said. "It's very pleasant. I have only just arrived. I met Miss Vivian." "And you are not coming in?" asked Angela's mother, very graciously. "Your daughter has not asked me," said Bernard. "Ah, my dearest," murmured Mrs. Vivian, looking at the girl. Her daughter returned her glance, and then the elder lady paused again and simply began to smile at Bernard, who recognized in her glance that queer little intimation, shy and cautious, yet perfectly discernible, of a desire to have a private understanding with what he felt that she mentally termed his better nature, which he had more than once perceived at Baden-Baden. "Ah, no, she has not asked me," Bernard repeated, laughing gently. Then Angela turned her eyes upon him, and the expression of those fine organs was strikingly agreeable. It had, moreover, the merit of being easily interpreted. It said very plainly, "Please don't insist, but leave me alone." And it said it not at all sharply, very gently and pleadingly. Bernard found himself understanding it so well that he literally blushed with intelligence. "Don't you come to the Casino in the evening, as you used to come to the Kursaal?" he asked. Mrs. Vivian looked again at her daughter, who had passed into the doorway of the cottage. Then she said, "We will go this evening." "I shall look for you eagerly," Bernard rejoined. "Auf Wiedersehen, as we used to say at Baden." Mrs. Vivian waved him a response over the gate. Her daughter gave him a glance from the threshold, and he took his way back to his inn. He awaited the evening with great impatience. He fancied he had made a discovery, and he wished to confirm it. The discovery was that his idea that she bore him a grudge, that she was conscious of an injury, that he was associated in her mind with a wrong, had all been a morbid illusion. She had forgiven, she had forgotten, she didn't care, she had possibly never cared. This at least was his theory now, and he longed for a little more light upon it. His old sense of her being a complex and intricate girl had, in that quarter of an hour of talk with her, again become lively, so that he was not absolutely sure his apprehensions had been vain. But with his quick vision of things he had got the impression, at any rate, that she had no vulgar resentment of any slight he might have put upon her, or any disadvantage he might have caused her. Her feeling about such a matter would be large and original. Bernard desired to see more of that, and in the evening, in fact, it seemed to him that he did so. The terrace of the Casino was far from offering the brilliant spectacle of the promenade in front of the gaming rooms at Baden. It had neither the liberal illumination, the distinguished frequenters, nor the superior music which formed the attraction of that celebrated spot, but it had a modest animation of its own, in which the starlight on the open sea took the place of clustered lamps, and the mighty resonance of the waves performed the function of an orchestra. Mrs. Vivian made her appearance with her daughter, and Bernard, as he used to do at Baden, chose a corner to place some chairs for them. The crowd was small, for most of the visitors had compressed themselves into one of the rooms, where a shrill operetta was being performed by a strolling troupe. Mrs. Vivian's visit was a short one. She remained at the Casino less than half an hour. But Bernard had some talk with Angela. He sat beside her. Her mother was on the other side, talking with an old French lady whose acquaintance she had made on the beach. Between Bernard and Angela several things were said. When his friends went away, Bernard walked home with them. He bade them good night at the door of their chalet, and then slowly strolled back to the Casino. The terrace was nearly empty. Every one had gone to listen to the operetta, the sound of whose contemporary gaiety came through the open, hot-looking windows in little, thin quavers and catches. The ocean was rumbling just beneath. It made a ruder but richer music. Bernard stood looking at it a moment. Then he went down the steps to the beach. The tide was rather low. He walked slowly down to the line of the breaking waves. The sea looked huge and black and simple. Everything was vague in the unassisted darkness. Bernard stood there some time. There was nothing but the sound and the sharp, fresh smell. Suddenly he put his hand to his heart, It was beating very fast. An immense conviction had come over him, abruptly then and there, and for a moment he held his breath. It was like a word spoken in the darkness. He held his breath to listen. He was in love with Angela Vivian, and his love was a throbbing passion. He sat down on the stones where he stood. It filled him with a kind of awe. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Confidence. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Confidence by Henry James, Chapter 21. It filled him with a kind of awe, and the feeling was by no means agreeable. It was not a feeling to which even a man of Bernard Longueville's easy power of extracting the savor from a sensation could rapidly habituate himself, and for the rest of that night it was far from making of our hero the happy man that a lover just coming to self-consciousness is supposed to be. It was wrong, it was dishonorable, it was impossible, and yet it was. It was as nothing in his own personal experience had ever been. He seemed hitherto to have been living by proxy, in a vision, in reflection, to have been an echo, a shadow, a futile attempt. But this at last was life itself, this was a fact, this was reality. For these things one lived, these were the things that people had died for. Love had been a fable before this, doubtless a very pretty one, and passion had been a literary phrase, employed obviously with considerable effect. But now he stood in a personal relation to these familiar ideas, which gave them a very much keener import. They had laid their hand upon him in the darkness. He felt it upon his shoulder, and he knew by its pressure that it was the hand of destiny. What made this sensation a shock was the element that was mixed with it, the fact that it came not simply and singly, but with an attendant shadow in which it immediately merged and lost itself. It was forbidden fruit. He knew it the instant he had touched it. He felt that he had pledged himself not to do just this thing which was gleaming before him so divinely, not to widen the crevice, not to open the door that would flood him with light. Friendship and honor were at stake. They stood at his left hand, as his newborn passion stood already at his right. They claimed him as well, and their grasp had a pressure which might become acutely painful. The soul is a still more tender organism than the body, and it shrinks from the prospect of being subjected to violence. Violence, spiritual violence, was what our luxurious hero feared, and it is not too much to say that as he lingered there by the sea late into the night, while the gurgitation of the waves grew deeper to his ear, the prospect came to have an element of positive terror. The two faces of his situation stood confronting each other. It was a rigid, brutal opposition, and Bernard held his breath for a while with the wonder of what would come of it. He sat a long time upon the beach. The night grew very cold, but he had no sense of it. Then he went away and passed before the casino again and wandered through the village. The casino was shrouded in darkness and silence, and there was nothing in the streets of the little town but the salt smell of the sea, a vague aroma of fish, and the distant sound of the breakers. Little by little Bernard lost the feeling of having been startled and began to perceive that he could reason about his trouble. Trouble it was, though this seems an odd name for the consciousness of a bright enchantment, and the first thing that reason, definitely consulted, told him about the matter was that he had been in love with Angela Vivian any time these 3 years. This sapient faculty supplied him with further information, only 2 or 3 of the items of which, however, it is necessary to reproduce. He had been a great fool, an incredible fool, not to have discovered before this what was the matter with him. Bernard's sense of his own shrewdness, always tolerably acute, had never received such a bruise as this present perception that a great many things had been taking place in his clever mind without his clever mind suspecting them. But it little mattered. His reason went on to declare what he had suspected or what he might now feel about it. His present business was to leave Blanc-les-Galets at sunrise the next morning and never rest his eyes upon Angela Vivian again. This was his duty. It had the merit of being perfectly plain and definite. easily apprehended, and unattended as far as he could discover with the smallest material difficulties. Not only this, reason continued to remark, but the moral difficulties were equally inconsiderable. He had never breathed a word of his passion to Miss Vivian. Quite the contrary. He had never committed himself, nor given her the smallest reason to suspect his hidden flame, and he was therefore perfectly free to turn his back upon her. He could never incur the reproach of trifling with her affections. Bernard was in that state of mind when it is the greatest of blessings to be saved the distress of choice, to see a straight path before you, and to feel that you have only to follow it. Upon the straight path I have indicated he fixed his eyes very hard. Of course he would take his departure at the earliest possible hour on the morrow. There was a streak of morning in the eastern sky by the time he knocked for readmittance at the door of the inn, which was opened to him by a mysterious old woman in a nightcap and meagre accessories whose identity he failed to ascertain. And he laid himself down to rest. He was very tired, with his attention fastened, as I say, on the idea, on the very image of departure. On waking up the next morning, rather late, he found, however, that it had attached itself to a very different object. His vision was filled with the brightness of the delightful fact itself, which seemed to impregnate the sweet morning air and to flutter in the light, fresh breeze that came through his open window from the sea. He saw a great patch of the sea between a couple of red tile roofs. It was bluer than any sea had ever been before. He had not slept long, only 3 or 4 hours, but he had quite slept off his dread. The shadow had dropped away, and nothing was left but the beauty of his love, which seemed to shine in the freshness of the early day. He felt absurdly happy, as if he had discovered El Dorado. Quite apart from consequences, he was not thinking of consequences, which of course were another affair. The feeling was intrinsically the finest one he had ever had, and as a mere feeling he had not done with it yet. The consideration of consequences could easily be deferred, and there would meanwhile be no injury to any one in his extracting, very quietly, a little subjective joy from the state of his heart. He would let the flower bloom for a day before plucking it up by the roots. Upon this latter course he was perfectly resolved, and in view of such an heroic resolution the subjective interlude appeared no more than his just privilege. The project of leaving Blanquais-les-Galets at 9 o'clock in the morning dropped lightly from his mind, making no noise as it fell. But another took its place, which had an air of being still more excellent, and which consisted of starting off on a long walk and absenting himself for the day. Bernard grasped his stick and wandered away. He climbed the great shoulder of the further cliff and found himself on the level downs. Here there was apparently no obstacle whatever to his walking as far as his fancy should carry him. The summer was still in a splendid mood, and the hot and quiet day, it was a Sunday, seemed to constitute a deep silent smile on the face of nature. The sea glistened on one side, and the crops ripened on the other. The larks, losing themselves in the dense sunshine, made it ring here and there in undiscoverable spots. This was the only sound, save when Bernard, pausing now and then in his walk, found himself hearing far below him at the base of the cliff the drawling murmur of a wave. He walked a great many miles and passed through 6 of those rude fishing hamlets lodged in some sloping hollow of the cliffs, so many of which of late years all along the Norman coast have adorned themselves with a couple of hotels and a row of bathing machines. He walked so far that the shadows had begun to lengthen before he bethought himself of stopping. The afternoon had come on and had already begun to wane. The grassy downs still stretched before him, shaded here and there with shallow but windless dells. He looked for the softest place and then flung himself down on the grass. He lay there for a long time, thinking of many things. He had determined to give himself up to a day's happiness. It was happiness of a very harmless kind, the satisfaction of thought, the bliss of mere consciousness. But such as it was, it did not elude him, nor turn bitter in his heart, and the long summer day closed upon him before his spirit, hovering in perpetual circles round the idea of what might be, had begun to rest its wing. When he rose to his feet again, it was too late to return to Blanquais in the same way that he had come. The evening was at hand, the light was already fading, and the walk he had taken was one which, even if he had not felt very tired, he would have thought it imprudent to attempt to repeat in the darkness. He made his way to the nearest village, where he was able to hire a rustic carriole, in which primitive conveyance. Gaining the high road, he jogged and jostled through the hours of the evening slowly back to his starting point. It wanted an hour of midnight by the time he reached his inn, and there was nothing left for him but to go to bed. He went in the unshaken faith that he should leave Blanquais early on the morrow. But early on the morrow it occurred to him that it would be simply grotesque to go off without taking leave of Mrs. Vivian and her daughter, and offering them some explanation of his intention. He had given them to understand that, so delighted was he to find them there, he would remain at Blanquais at least as long as they. He must have seemed to them wanting in civility to spend a whole bright Sunday without apparently troubling his head about them, and if the unlucky fact of his being in love with the girl were a reason for doing his duty, it was at least not a reason for being rude. He had not yet come to that, to accepting rudeness as an incident of virtue. It had always been his theory that virtue had the best manners in the world, and he flattered himself at any rate that he could guard his integrity without making himself ridiculous. So at what he thought a proper hour in the course of the morning, he retraced his steps along the little lane through which 2 days ago Angela Vivian had shown him the way to her mother's door. At this humble portal he knocked. The windows of the little chalet were open, and the white curtains behind the flower pots were fluttering as he had seen them before. The door was opened by a neat young woman, who informed him very promptly that Madame and Mademoiselle had left Blanquais a couple of hours earlier. They had gone to Paris. Yes, very suddenly, taking with them but little luggage, and they had left her. She had the honor of being the femme de chambre of ces dames, to put up their remaining possessions and follow as soon as possible. On Bernard's expressing surprise and saying that he had supposed them to be fixed at the seaside for the rest of the season, the femme de chambre, who seemed a very intelligent person, begged to remind him that the season was drawing to a close, that Madame had taken the chalet but for 5 weeks, only 10 days of which period were yet to expire, that ces dames, as Monsieur perhaps knew, were great travellers, who had been half over the world, and thought nothing of breaking camp at an hour's notice, and that, in fine, Madame might very well have received a telegram summoning her to another part of the country. "And where have the ladies gone?" asked Bernard. "For the moment to Paris." "And in Paris where have they gone?" "Dames chez elles, to their house," said the femme de chambre, who appeared to think that Bernard asked too many questions. But Bernard persisted. "Where is their house?" The waiting maid looked at him from head to foot. "If Monsieur wishes to write, many of Madame's letters come to her banker," she said inscrutably. "And who is her banker?" "He lives in the Rue de Provence." "Very good. I will find him out," said our hero, turning away. The discriminating reader, who has been so good as to interest himself in this little narrative, will perhaps at this point exclaim with a pardonable consciousness of shrewdness, "Of course he went the next day to the Rue de Provence." Of course, yes, only, as it happens, Bernard did nothing of the kind. He did one of the most singular things he ever did in his life, a thing that puzzled him even at the time, and with regard to which he often afterward wondered whence he had drawn the ability for so remarkable a feat. He simply spent a fortnight at Blanquais-les-Galets. It was a very quiet fortnight. He spoke to no one. He formed no relations. He was company to himself. It may be added that he had never found his own company half so good. He struck himself as a reasonable, delicate fellow, who looked at things in such a way as to make him refrain successfully, that was the point, from concerning himself practically about Angela Vivian. His saying that he would find out the banker in the Rue de Provence had been for the benefit of the femme de chambre, whom he thought rather impertinent. He had really no intention whatever of entering that classic thoroughfare. He took long walks, rambled on the beach, along the base of the cliffs, and among the brown sea caves, and he thought a good deal of certain incidents which have figured at an earlier stage of this narrative. He had forbidden himself the future as an object of contemplation, and it was therefore a matter of necessity that his imagination should take refuge among the warm and familiar episodes of the past. He wondered why Mrs. Vivian should have left the place so suddenly, and was of course struck with the analogy between this incident and her abrupt departure from Baden. It annoyed him, it troubled him, but it by no means rekindled the alarm he had felt on first perceiving the injured Angela on the beach. That alarm had been quenched by Angela's manner during the hour that followed and during their short walk in the evening. This evening was to be forever memorable, for it had brought with it the revelation which still, at moments, suddenly made Bernard tremble. But it had also brought him the assurance that Angela cared as little as possible for anything that a chance acquaintance might have said about her. It is all the more singular, therefore, that one evening, after he had been at Blanquais a fortnight, a train of thought should suddenly have been set in motion in his mind. It was kindled by no outward occurrence, but by some wandering spark of fancy or of memory, and the immediate effect of it was to startle our hero very much as he had been startled on the evening I have described. The circumstances were the same. He had wandered down to the beach alone very late, and he stood looking at the duskily tumbling sea. Suddenly the same voice that had spoken before murmured another phrase in the darkness, and it rang upon his ear for the rest of the night. It startled him, as I have said, at first, then, the next morning, it led him to take his departure for Paris. During the journey it lingered in his ear. He sat in the corner of the railway carriage with his eyes closed, abstracted, on purpose to prolong the reverberation. If it were not true, it was at least, as the Italians have it, ben trovato, and it was wonderful how well it bore thinking of. It bears telling less well, but I can at least give a hint of it. The theory that Angela hated him had evaporated in her presence, and another of a very different sort had sprung into being. It fitted a great many of the facts, it explained a great many contradictions, anomalies, mysteries, and it accounted for Miss Vivian's insisting upon her mother's leaving Blanquais at a few hours' notice, even better than the theory of her resentment could have done. At any rate, it obliterated Bernard's scruples very effectually, and led him on his arrival in Paris to repair instantly to the Rue de Provence. This street contains more than one banker, but there is one with whom Bernard deemed Mrs. Vivian most likely to have dealings. He found he had reckoned rightly, and he had no difficulty in procuring her address. Having done so, however, he by no means went immediately to see her. He waited a couple of days, perhaps to give those obliterated scruples I have spoken of a chance to revive. They kept very quiet, and it must be confessed that Bernard took no great pains to recall them to life. After he had been in Paris 3 days, he knocked at Mrs. Vivian's door. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Confidence. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Confidence by Henry James, Chapter 22. It was opened by the little waiting maid whom he had seen at Blanquais, and who looked at him very hard before she answered his inquiry. "Yes, I have found Mrs. Vivian's dwelling, though you wouldn't give me the address," Bernard said to her, smiling. "Monsieur has put some time to it," the young woman answered dryly, and she informed him that Madame was at home, though Mademoiselle, for whom he had not asked, was not. Mrs. Vivian occupied a diminutive apartment at the summit of one of the tall white houses which ornament the neighborhood of the Arc de Triomphe. The early days of September had arrived, but Paris was still a city of absentees. The weather was warm and charming, and a certain savor of early autumn in the air was in accord with the somewhat melancholy aspect of the empty streets and closed shutters of this honorable quarter, where the end of the monumental vista seemed to be curtained with a hazy emanation from the Seine. It was late in the afternoon when Bernard was ushered into Mrs. Vivian's little high-nestling drawing-room, and a patch of sunset tints, faintly red, rested softly upon the gilded wall. Bernard had seen these ladies only in borrowed and provisional abodes, but here was a place where they were really living, and which was stamped with their tastes, their habits, their charm. The little salon was very elegant. It contained a multitude of pretty things, and it appeared to Bernard to be arranged in perfection. The long windows, the ceiling being low, they were really very short, opened upon one of those solid balconies occupying the width of the apartment, which are often in Paris a compensation for living up 5 flights of stairs, and this balcony was filled with flowers and cushions. Bernard stepped out upon it to await the coming of Mrs. Vivian, and as she was not quick to appear, he had time to see that his friends enjoyed a magnificent view. They looked up at the triumphal arch, which presented itself at a picturesque angle, and near the green tree tops of the Champs-Élysées, beyond which they caught a broad gleam of the Seine and a glimpse, blue in the distance, of the great towers of Notre Dame. The whole vast city lay before them and beneath them, with its ordered brilliancy and its mingled aspect of compression and expansion, and yet the huge Parisian murmur died away before it reached Mrs. Vivian's sky parlor, which seemed to Bernard the brightest and quietest little habitation he had ever known. His hostess came rustling in at last. She seemed agitated. She knocked over, with the skirt of her dress, a little gilded chair which was reflected in the polished parquet, as in a sheet of looking-glass. Mrs. Vivian had a fixed smile. She hardly knew what to say. "I found your address at the banker's," said Bernard. "Your maid at Blanquet refused to give it to me." Mrs. Vivian gave him a little look. There was always more or less of it in her face, which seemed equivalent to an entreaty that her interlocutor should spare her. "Maids are so strange," she murmured, "especially the French." It pleased Bernard for the moment not to spare her, though he felt a sort of delight of kindness for her. "Your going off from Blanquet so suddenly, without leaving me any explanation, any clue, any message of any sort, made me feel at first as if you didn't wish that I should look you up. It reminded me of the way you left Baden, do you remember, 3 years ago?" "Baden was so charming, but one couldn't stay forever," said Mrs. Vivian. "I had a sort of theory one could. Our life was so pleasant that it seemed a shame to break the spell, and if no one had moved I am sure we might be sitting there now." Mrs. Vivian stared, still with her little fixed smile. "I think we should have had bad weather." "Very likely," said Bernard, laughing. "Nature would have grown jealous of our good humor, of our tranquil happiness. And after all, here we are together again, that is, some of us. But I have only my own audacity to thank for it. I was quite free to believe that you were not at all pleased to see me reappear, and it is only because I am not easy to discourage, am indeed probably a rather impudent fellow, that I have ventured to come here to-day." "I am very glad to see you reappear, Mr. Longueville," Mrs. Vivian declared with the accent of veracity. "It was your daughter's idea, then, running away from Blanquet?" Mrs. Vivian lowered her eyes. "We were obliged to go to Fontainebleau. We have but just come back. I thought of writing to you," she softly added. "Ah, what pleasure that would have given me! I mean to tell you where we were, and that we should have been so happy to see you. I thank you for the intention. I suppose your daughter wouldn't let you carry it out." "Angela is so peculiar," Mrs. Vivian said simply. "You told me that the first time I saw you." "Yes, at Siena," said Mrs. Vivian. "I am glad to hear you speak frankly of that place. Perhaps it's better," Mrs. Vivian murmured. She got up and went to the window. Then, stepping upon the balcony, she looked down a moment into the street. "She will come back in a moment," she said, coming into the room again. "She has gone to see a friend who lives just beside us. We don't mind about Siena now," she added softly. Bernard understood her, understood this to be a retraction of the request she had made of him at Baden. "Dear little woman," he said to himself, "she wants to marry her daughter still, only now she wants to marry her to me." He wished to show her that he understood her, and he was on the point of seizing her hand, to do he didn't know what, to hold it, to press it, to kiss it, when he heard the sharp twang of the bell at the door of the little apartment. Mrs. Vivian fluttered away. "It's Angela!" she cried, and she stood there waiting and listening, smiling at Bernard, with her handkerchief pressed to her lips. In a moment the girl came into the drawing-room, but on seeing Bernard she stopped, with her hand on the door-knob. Her mother went to her and kissed her. "It's Mr. Longueville, dearest. He has found us out." "Found us out?" repeated Angela, with a little laugh. "What a singular expression!" She was blushing, as she had blushed when she first saw him at Blanquet. She seemed to Bernard now to have a great and peculiar brightness, something she had never had before. "I certainly have been looking for you," he said. "I was greatly disappointed when I found you had taken flight from Blanquet." "Taken flight?" She repeated his words as she had repeated her mother's. "That is also a strange way of speaking." "I don't care what I say," said Bernard, "so long as I make you understand that I have wanted very much to see you again, and that I have wondered every day whether I might venture—" "I don't know why you shouldn't venture," she interrupted, giving her little laugh again. "We are not so terrible, are we, mamma?" That is, when once you have climbed our 5 flights of stairs." "I came up very fast," said Bernard, "and I find your apartment magnificent. Mr. Longueville must come again, must he not, dear?" asked mamma. "I shall come very often, with your leave," Bernard declared. "It will be immensely kind," said Angela, looking away. "I'm not sure that you will think it that." "I don't know what you are trying to prove," said Angela. "First that we ran away from you, and then that we are not nice to our visitors." "Oh, no, not that!" Bernard exclaimed. "For I assure you I shall not care how cold you are with me." She walked away toward another door, which was masked with a curtain that she lifted. "I am glad to hear that, for it gives me courage to say that I am very tired, and that I beg you will excuse me." She glanced at him a moment over her shoulder, then she passed out, dropping the curtain. Bernard stood there face to face with Mrs. Vivian, whose eyes seemed to plead with him more than ever. In his own there was an excited smile. "Please don't mind that," she murmured. "I know it's true that she is tired." "Mind it, dear lady?" cried the young man. "I delight in it. It's just what I like." "Ah, she's very peculiar," sighed Mrs. Vivian. "She is strange, yes. But I think I understand her a little." "You must come back to morrow, then." "I hope to have many to morrows," cried Bernard as he took his departure. End of chapter 22.